A few years ago, my wife and I decided to spend a long weekend at a lake we'd been to multiple times. It was one of those quiet, out-of-the-way spots, the kind where you go to get away from everything. The place had always been peaceful, perfect for unwinding, but that weekend felt different in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on. The first 2 days were uneventful. We spent our time hiking the trails, lounging by the water, and enjoying the break from the noise of daily life. By the third evening, my wife suggested going for a swim to cool off. The sun had just dipped below the trees, leaving the lake bathed in the dim light of dusk. The water was so still, almost like glass, reflecting the last streaks of color in the sky. I stayed on the shore, watching as she waded out into the water, her silhouette growing smaller as she swam further. I remember thinking how quiet everything had gotten. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the soft ripple of the water. But I didn't pay much attention to it at the time. After a few minutes, she stopped. I figured she was just taking a break, floating for a bit. But something in the way she froze caught my attention. She wasn't relaxing, she was standing, looking back at me. There was a hesitation in her posture, like she wasn't sure what had just happened. I called out, asking if she was okay. She didn't answer right away, but when she did, her voice sounded shaky, almost like she didn't want to believe what she was saying. "I think I stepped on something," she called, her voice faint against the open water. I laughed it off at first, figuring it was just a rock or some lake debris. But then she took a few hurried steps toward the shore and called out again, louder this time. It felt like a face. "I'm serious," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It felt like a nose, a mouth. I stepped on someone. I didn't know what to think. Part of me wanted to go in and check for myself, but another part of me hesitated. Something about the way she looked at the water, like she was expecting something to surface, made me stop. We decided to leave the lake for the night, figuring we'd report it in the morning if we really thought something was there. But that night, as we were packing up our things, something started to click. There had been strange moments throughout the trip, small things we'd brushed off. On the first night, we thought we saw a figure near the water's edge, just as the light was fading. I'd chalked it up to shadows, maybe an animal, but now it didn't feel so innocent. My wife had noticed it too, though neither of us had really talked about it until now. As we sat in the cabin that night, the unease grew. We kept hearing the wind picking up, but the trees weren't moving. There was a heavy silence, the kind that presses in from all sides. It felt like something was waiting just outside, watching us. We both tried to sleep, but neither of us managed more than a few restless hours. I remember waking up several times, glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone standing there. The next morning, we packed up and were getting ready to leave when we heard something on the radio. The body of a man had been found in the lake, not far from where we had been the night before. He'd been missing for weeks, and they'd found him caught on some rocks just beneath the surface. The police had pieced together a rough story. He was involved in something shady, a bad deal, something about money. He hadn't drowned by accident. He'd been left there, his body hidden under the still waters. I don't know how long he had been there, but judging by the state of him, it had been days, maybe weeks. Suddenly, everything made sense. The figure by the lake, the unease we couldn't shake. The people responsible for his death had been around, probably scoping out the area, making sure no one got too close before they left. We had unknowingly stumbled into the aftermath of something dark, something dangerous. And when my wife stepped on that body, it was more than just a terrifying moment. It was a near miss with whatever had happened out there. Looking back, I realize how close we came to becoming part of that story. If we had been there a few days earlier, if we'd seen something we weren't supposed to, who knows what might have happened to us. A few years ago, I was living in a small, quiet town. Life was steady, predictable even. I had a good routine, a solid job, and everything seemed normal. But one November evening, everything changed in ways I'll never forget. I lived near what I always thought was just a regular office building. It blended into the surroundings, the kind of place you walk by every day without giving it a second thought. Nothing about it ever stood out. That's why, when the explosion happened, it took everyone by surprise. That day started like any other. I'd finished work and decided to head to the gym to work out. It was a short walk, maybe 10 minutes. The air was cool, the streets were quiet, and I remember thinking how peaceful the evening felt. I couldn't have known that it was about to turn into one of the most horrifying nights of my life. As I neared the gym, just a couple of minutes away, I felt something strange, like the ground shifted beneath me for a split second. Before I could even process what was happening, there was a deafening explosion. It wasn't just loud, it was like the air itself was being torn apart. The force of the blast knocked me off my feet, and it felt like something hit me square in the chest. I was flat on the ground before I even realized what had happened. For a few seconds, all I could hear was ringing in my ears, like I'd been thrown into a vacuum. When I looked around, I saw cars with shattered windows, alarms blaring, and debris falling from the sky. The air smelled sharp and metallic, mixed with something burnt. It clung to everything like a bad memory. It took me a moment to realize what was landing around me, small, soft fragments that clung to my clothes. I looked down at my arm and saw it, pieces of human skin. I brushed it off, horrified. My stomach turned as I started to make sense of the chaos around me. There were more of these fragments scattered across the ground, along with shards of glass and bits of concrete. Shaking off the shock, I forced myself to get up and walk toward the source of the explosion. As I moved closer, the destruction became clearer. The building that had stood there for years, unnoticed by me and everyone else, was gone. In its place was a massive crater, 30 feet wide, filled with water and debris. The structure had been completely obliterated. Nothing but rubble and twisted metal remained. The streets around the crater were like a war zone. Bodies lay on the ground, some of them missing limbs, others burned beyond recognition. People were screaming for help, but there was no one to help them. One woman caught my eye, crying inconsolably as she held her husband, who had been gravely injured in the blast. The devastation was beyond words, like something out of a nightmare. But the image that stays with me, the one that refuses to fade, was of a young man, barely in his 20s. He lay still on the ground, his body in an unnatural position, as if broken by the force of the impact. His head was turned toward me, his eyes wide open, staring straight at me. Even though I knew he was gone, it felt as though he was still trying to communicate, silently calling out, but I couldn't understand what. I stood there for what felt like hours, but it must have only been a few minutes. The police and emergency services arrived, but I couldn't stay any longer. The sight of all that destruction and death was too much for me to handle. I turned and walked back to my apartment, my head spinning from the shock of it all. For days after the explosion, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that young man. His body broken, his eyes staring at me like he knew something I didn't. But it wasn't just in my dreams. At night, I would wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, and I'd see him standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. It wasn't a shadow or a vague figure. It was him, clear as day, standing in my room, just staring. I knew it wasn't real. I knew it had to be some kind of psychological effect from the trauma of that night. But it didn't matter. Every night, I'd wake up, and there he was, never moving, never speaking, just staring. I'd blink, and he'd be gone. But the fear was real. It wasn't just a nightmare. It felt like he'd followed me home, and he wasn't going to leave until I understood something. Something I was too scared to figure out. This went on for nearly 3 weeks. I dreaded the nights, knowing that I'd see him again. I started sleeping with the lights on, but it didn't help. No matter what I did, I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find him there, watching me, waiting. Eventually, the vision stopped, but the memory of that young man and that night has never left me. Even now, years later, I can't hear a loud noise or sudden bang without my mind snapping back to that moment. That explosion shattered more than just glass and buildings. It shattered my sense of safety. And though the visions have faded, I'll never forget those nights when I was sure that I wasn't alone in my own home. I remember the night my daughter came downstairs, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear, as if she had seen something truly horrifying. She was only 10 at that age when nightmares seem more real than anything else. But this wasn't just an ordinary bad dream. There was something about the way she trembled that unnerved me. "Dad, I saw eyes," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. "In my closet. They're watching me." It wasn't the first time she had said something like this. For weeks she'd been complaining about feeling watched at night. She would wake us up, terrified, saying she could see eyes staring at her from the darkness of her closet. Every time I brushed it off, telling her it was her imagination, that it was just shadows playing tricks on her in the dim light of her nightstand lamp. But that night, something felt different. I don't know if it was the way her voice quivered or the look in her eyes, wide with genuine fear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe this wasn't just a child's nightmare. Maybe there was something more. Still, I didn't want to scare her. I gave her the usual line. "There's nothing to worry about, sweetie. It's just your imagination. Come on, let's get you back to bed." I walked her back to her room, trying to reassure her, even though something in the pit of my stomach didn't feel right. When we reached her room, everything was quiet. The air was still, and the moonlight streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. I turned on the light and glanced at the closet. The door was slightly open, just as she had described. I tried to ignore the knot of unease forming in my chest. "Let me show you," I said, walking toward the closet. "There's nothing there. Just clothes, maybe some old toys." As I reached for the handle, my hand trembled slightly, but I forced myself to stay calm for her sake. "There's nothing to be afraid of," I reassured her again, my voice sounding more confident than I felt. I pulled the door, but it didn't budge. That's when my heart dropped to my stomach. The door wouldn't open. Someone, was holding it shut from the other side. The blood drained from my face as I realized my daughter wasn't imagining things. I told her to go downstairs, my voice calm but firm. She didn't argue, sensing the urgency in my tone. Once she was gone, I forced the door open with all my strength, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside the closet, crouched in the shadows, was a woman. Her face was gaunt, her clothes torn and dirty, but it was her eyes that struck me first. They were wide, unblinking, and locked onto mine. It was as though she had been waiting for me. For a brief moment, I didn't recognize her. The matted hair, the wild look in her eyes. It was like she had been living in a nightmare of her own. Then it hit me. This was no stranger. This was my wife, my ex-wife. Years ago, she had been committed to a psychiatric facility after a mental breakdown. Her obsession with our daughter had become unhealthy, dangerous even. She had tried to take her away once, convinced that only she could keep her safe from the world. When the court had taken away her visitation rights, she snapped. But this was beyond anything I could have imagined. She was barely recognizable. Her hair was patchy, as if she had been pulling it out in clumps. The skin on her scalp was raw, streaked with blood where the hair had been torn. Her once beautiful face was twisted in madness, and there was something else in her expression, a kind of hunger, like she had been feeding off the fear she had instilled in our daughter. How did you get here?" I stammered, barely able to speak. My mind raced, trying to piece together how she had escaped the facility, how she had been hiding in our house without us noticing. But the look in her eyes told me she wasn't about to answer. She took a step forward, and instinctively I backed away. There was something predatory in the way she moved, like she was savoring the moment. I realized with growing horror that this wasn't the first time she had been here. She had been hiding in the closet for days, maybe even weeks, watching our daughter, waiting for the right moment to... I didn't even want to think about what she had planned. "You took her away from me," she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. "You all did. But I found her. I've been here, watching, protecting her from the world." I was frozen in place, my mind racing. She had been here, in my home, standing just feet away from my daughter every night, watching her sleep. I felt sick to my stomach. I had failed her. I had told her there was nothing to be afraid of, that the eyes she saw in the dark were just her imagination. But they weren't. I had let this happen, and the guilt was overwhelming. My hands clenched into fists as the anger surged through me. This woman had not only terrified my daughter, but she had shattered what little peace we had left. I lunged forward, grabbing her by the arm and dragging her out of the closet, my mind a blur of rage and fear. She fought back, but I was stronger. I pinned her to the ground and held her there until the police arrived, her wild eyes never leaving mine. The aftermath was a blur of sirens, flashing lights, and questions I didn't have answers to. My daughter and I have both been through extensive therapy since then. We're healing, but it's a slow process. Every night, I still check her closet, just to be sure. I'll never forget the way she looked at me, as if she believed she was doing the right thing. And I'll never forget the feeling of having let my daughter down when she needed me the most. It was the late 80s, and I was about 7 or 8 years old. My dad and I were heading into a neighborhood that always seemed to carry a sense of unease. the kind of place where you were hyper-aware of every step you took. My dad had to return a library book, and the only branch open was in a nearby area we didn't go to often. It was the kind of neighborhood that had a reputation. People talked about it in whispers, warning others to be careful. We were used to being cautious, but this place was different. You could feel it in the air. I remember walking alongside him, my small hand wrapped in his, feeling his usual confidence. But this time, he was more alert, scanning our surroundings as if he knew something I didn't. He told me not to use my real name if anyone asked, and gave me a common name that would blend in better with the locals. I didn't fully understand why at the time, but I could sense that pretending to be someone else was somehow important, like it might protect us from whatever danger lingered in this part of town. We turned down a street and I noticed a group of men gathered ahead. They were standing in clusters, murmuring amongst themselves, and glancing across the road like they were waiting for something, or someone. One man, taller than the rest, stood out. He had long, greasy hair, and his leather jacket glinted under the sun. My dad's grip on my hand tightened, just slightly. He didn't say anything, but the tension in his posture told me that we needed to move quickly. We weren't headed directly toward them, so I thought we'd just slip by unnoticed. That's when I saw her, a woman, maybe in her late 40s, with short red hair, purposefully making her way toward us. There was something in the way she moved, fast, direct, and not friendly. She stopped right in front of us, her eyes darting from my dad to me, sizing us up like she could sense we didn't belong there. Her voice was shaky, her tone forced, as if she was trying to sound casual but couldn't hide the underlying suspicion. "Where are you from?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "What brings you this way?" My dad stayed calm. He spoke with the same casual tone he always did, but I could feel his unease. He mentioned we were just there to return a book and pointed to the library down the road as proof. She wasn't convinced, though. She pressed him further, fishing for details, her eyes occasionally darting toward me, as if trying to catch me off guard. I could feel sweat forming on my palms, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that I barely heard the exchange. Every second felt like an eternity. I wanted to run, but I was rooted to the spot, terrified that if I moved, something terrible would happen. My dad gave her my fake name when she asked, and I did my best to act normal, but I knew she could see the fear in my eyes. I could feel her watching us long after my dad said goodbye, and we walked away, her stare burning into the back of my neck. I glanced over my shoulder and saw her walking back toward the group of men, whispering something to the creepy guy in the leather jacket. As we went around the corner, I thought we were safe, but the uneasy silence that followed was worse. We were walking down a long road, the kind that makes you feel exposed, with fences on one side and rows of houses on the other. The further we went, the more it felt like we were being led into something we couldn't escape from. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, but got closer. I glanced back and saw him, the creepy man in the leather jacket, following us. My heart nearly stopped. My dad leaned down and told me to run ahead to check if the library was open. I hesitated, not wanting to leave him, but he urged me to go. My legs felt like lead as I ran down the road, every step heavy with the fear that something awful was about to happen. I reached the library and pushed the door open. It was unlocked. Relief washed over me, but it disappeared quickly. I turned to run back, my eyes searching for my dad. When I saw him, he was alone. The man had stopped, turned, and was walking away. My dad's shoulders were tense, his fists clenched at his sides. He told me it was all right now, that we were safe. But his voice was tight, as if he wasn't entirely convinced. Later that day, when we were finally home, the news came on. A local taxi driver had been shot, not far from where we had walked. The same street and the same group of men. I realized then what I had sensed earlier wasn't just a feeling, it was real danger. I had been inches away from something far worse, and I'd never forget the look on my dad's face that told me we had just barely made it out. In the early 1930s, my great-grandfather Richard was married to Evelyn, my great-grandmother. They had a little girl, my grandmother, who was around 3 years old at the time. Life was tough, but manageable, and Evelyn had a close friend named Margaret. They were inseparable and were always spending time together. They shared secrets and supported each other through life's struggles. Margaret, however, had a secret obsession with Richard, one that would drive her to commit an unforgivable act. One afternoon, Evelyn, Margaret, and my grandmother went for a walk along a cliffside path. It was a common thing for the two friends to do, enjoy the fresh air and the breathtaking views of the sea. The cliffs, though beautiful, were dangerous, but they had never worried much about it before. But that day was different. My grandmother recalled the moment with eerie clarity, even though she was just a child. The walk had started out pleasant enough, but as they neared the edge of the cliff, Margaret's tone shifted. She and Evelyn began exchanging sharp words, though my grandmother couldn't understand what they were arguing about. It didn't take long for Margaret's jealousy to boil over. In a sudden, violent act, Margaret shoved Evelyn with all her strength. Evelyn's scream echoed across the cliffs as she lost her footing and plunged over the edge, disappearing into the jagged rocks below. My grandmother stood frozen, too shocked and scared to scream. She had just witnessed her mother being murdered. Margaret, her face cold and emotionless, quickly grabbed my grandmother's hand and pulled her away from the scene. "You didn't see anything," Margaret whispered in a chillingly calm voice. "No one will believe you." My grandmother, too terrified to respond, silently followed her back along the path. Margaret knew no one would believe a child, especially when the world saw them as close friends. When the authorities investigated, Margaret told everyone that Evelyn had slipped and fallen. It wasn't hard for people to accept that narrative. After all, they had been friends, and it was easy to believe that Evelyn had simply lost her balance near the edge. The case was closed as a tragic accident, and no one suspected foul play. No one, except for my grandmother. Margaret wasted no time moving in on Richard, pretending to be the supportive friend in the wake of his wife's death. Not long after, she convinced him to marry her. Margaret's plan had worked. She had replaced Evelyn not only in Richard's life, but also as the mother figure in the household. From the outside, it looked like she was stepping in to help a grieving family. But inside the house, the story was very different. Margaret knew that my grandmother had seen everything. She tormented her with subtle, cruel gestures when no one was looking. Whenever my grandmother was alone with her, Margaret would stand behind her smiling and make pushing motions, as if she was mocking me about what she had done. She would lean in close and whisper, "No one will ever believe you." My grandmother lived in fear, knowing her mother's murderer was living under the same roof, sharing meals with her, pretending to be her caretaker. Richard, blinded by grief and Margaret's manipulation, never saw the truth. He doted on Margaret's children from her previous marriage, while my grandmother was treated as an outsider in her own home. The favoritism was obvious, and the constant torment only deepened the trauma. Margaret made sure my grandmother knew her place in the household and never let her forget the day on the cliffs. The weight of the secret was too much for my grandmother to bear, but she had no choice. She tried to speak out, but no one would believe her, and everyone just thought she was jealous of her new stepmother. So she stayed silent, forced to endure years of psychological torment from the woman who had taken everything from her. Finally, as soon as she was old enough, my grandmother married and left the house. She couldn't escape the memories, but at least she was free from Margaret. For years, she kept the truth locked inside, sharing it only with close family, but the trauma had already left its scars. Years later, when Margaret fell ill and lay on her deathbed, the weight of her crime finally broke her. Perhaps it was fear of the afterlife, or maybe her conscience had finally caught up with her. In those last moments, she confessed everything. How she had pushed Evelyn off the cliff, how she had carefully manipulated Richard, and how she had tormented my grandmother for all those years. But by then it was too late. The authorities never reopened the case, and Richard had already passed away, never knowing the truth. My grandmother, who had lived with the pain and knowledge of her mother's murder for so long, was finally vindicated. But the confession didn't bring the closure she had hoped for. The damage was done. Margaret had stolen years of her life, and her confession couldn't undo the suffering. To this day, my grandmother's story haunts our family. The weight of that dark secret, of witnessing her mother's murder and living under the roof of her killer, was something no child should ever have to bear.